So, hello everyone, I'm Chris, and welcome all to Rise of the Robots. Thank you all for being so patient and waiting for us to get started as Helen and Nick arrived. I'm going to set the scene with a few words, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves today, and then we'll have about 10-15 minutes of conversation here with a few questions, and we're going to open up to the group and invite you all to contribute and be part of this discussion and this panel as well. As we've been saying in other sessions as well, if you don't feel like the session is working for you, if you want to go do something else or go out into the sunshine, feel free to stand up and move outside. That's no problems at all. You're absolutely welcome to do that here. So, we are living in a rapid evolution, a rapid change in technology and even just the meaning and understanding of what is work. How has the kind of the technology and the AI and the systems behind it has evolved and changed and is enabling us to do something new, to rethink how we approach society, how we approach capitalism, how we approach making money and doing business. How do we become self-sufficient, self-sustaining? Hopefully, we'll solve all of these problems in 90 minutes or so. Give or take. We won't, but just a disclaimer. But to start off, I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll go from there. So if I hand over to you, Nick.
Okay. So I'll apologize on behalf of privatized rail for being late. Hopefully Corbyn gets elected and we can get some nationalized rail again. So my name's Nick Srnicek. I'm a lecturer at City University in London. I wrote a book called Inventing the Future, which is all about the sort of changes in technology in the labor market and how the left can respond to it without falling back to sort of traditional ideas around full employment. So I'll be talking about that today.
Hi, I'm Helen Hester. I'm an Associate Professor of Media and Communications at the University of West London. My research is on sort of gender, technology and work, including theories of social reproduction and sex work. And Nick and I are working on a book together called After Work. The subtitle used to be What's Left and Who Cares? And now it's The Politics of Free Time.
Nice. Rachel?
I am Rachel Dobbs. I'm an artist and educator based here in Plymouth. I was wondering what kind of qualifies me for this panel, and then I realised it might be my nickname, 5 Jobs Dobbs. So I'm like a serial precarious worker. I currently hold 0 hours contracts with the University of Plymouth and Plymouth College of Arts. Also known as associate lectureships. Yes, I'm interested in this topic from the perspective of, as an educator, what does it mean to prepare young people for a world of work and employability? Those are current kind of buzzwords in education. If one is to believe that those things may or may not exist by the time that people graduate from university.
Great. And I'm Chris Hunn. I'm a creative technologist, and I do lots of work with artists, businesses, and researchers around AI, data collection, machine learning, programming, and I'm interested in kind of all these kind of political and cultural discussions around some of the work I'm doing. So I think, and that leads me on to kind of my first question for the panel, is if I'm working with businesses, a lot of them will call it the fourth industrial revolution. They'll give it a catch-all term for a big swathe of changes in technology and automation. And how do you feel and how would you respond to that?
So maybe to set out and explain a little bit about what the fourth industrial revolution refers to. It's one of these sort of branding terms that capitalists like to come up with. And it's basically the idea of attaching, an entire factory to the internet and allowing sort of different machines and elements of a factory to talk to each other, to make that factory more productive, more efficient, more flexible, and then, extending this to the rest of society as well. So sort of connecting everything up to the internet. And this is supposed to be, the promise is that it's supposed to increase, economic growth and productivity and everything. There's a couple interesting dynamics around it. I think one interesting aspect is who controls this. And there's an interesting element where it's these companies owning platforms who are starting to own a lot of this stuff, controlling the data that is produced by all of this. And so I think there's, it seems like a nice thing, this fourth industrial revolution, but I think there's really a centralization of power and a centralization of ownership that's going on when we look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that issue of ownership is a really important one, because obviously a lot of what we do and a lot of what Nick's done in the past centres around this idea of post-work. So it's using work as kind of a vector for building up some kind of a politics that's future-oriented, of sort of robust, leftist, future-oriented politics that's designed to respond to this changing landscape of work that automation is kind of ushering in. But obviously, talking about post-work, it can only take us so far. You need to reflect upon these issues of, of capital and property and ownership. So that's really kind of vital. On the way up here, actually, I was reading a report by the IPPR, which was looking at this idea of creating kind of citizen data banks. So this idea of, can you put big data into the hands of the general population in a different way? Can you democratically govern it in new ways? I think this is kind of an important thing to be thinking about. But at the same time, I would say that why work is useful in terms of framing these issues is that we all have a relationship with it. So, I mean, I try and think to myself why I'm kind of drawn to thinking about post-work when I think about automation. And particularly it's because it does serve this purpose of we all have a relationship with it, whether we are working 5 jobs, whether we are looking for work, whether we are out of work. And we all have a kind of, work is really central to the way that we see ourselves. And for my generation and younger at least, I think, there's a sense in which work has failed to deliver on its promise. We were kind of brought up with this idea of like employability, that's the crucial thing, I work at the University of West London when we frame ourselves as the careers university. So the kind of discourse that you're discussing is one I'm very familiar with. And suddenly you're kind of emerging into a world of work that is about 0 hours, that's not about job security, where actually the work ethic isn't tied into a sense of self in the same way. And actually work isn't delivering on its promise. And I think that is a ground for a really sort of coalitional politics, where it's something that we can build a mass movement around potentially. But again, as Nick was saying, you have to make sure that property and ownership is really factored into those discussions.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I'm interested in engaging students who I work with in conversations around, is that kind of critical understanding of what the situation in which they live or are entering is. And it becomes increasingly difficult when the lecturers don't even know. So that sense of this being framed as a revolution, I guess, is probably quite poignant in that we're all working it out. Every single person in this room is working it out. Things are very different to when any of us were born. And that might be due to like the kind of acceptance of neoliberal policy, of monetarist, the kind of results of monetarist powers in Europe and the West. But also these ideas of like self have changed quite considerably. So even since the time that I graduated and left university about 15 years ago, that at the time the dominant discourses in education around work were around creating a self-image and a brand. Now that seems almost like entry level for the students who I work with, who have been creating a self-image and a brand since they've been using devices, since they've been generating profiles, since they've been unwittingly generating kind of pictures of themselves as consumers and as individuals. So I'm kind of interested in, hopefully, the collective mass of knowledge in this room might have some ideas for what the hell I can be teaching people about employability and these notions around what does it mean to like significantly change work ethic. It's so different to what I have been kind of raised with, what my parents were raised with, or what their parents were raised with, these kind of values or ideas. So I'm really interested to find those things out.
And you're totally right about the way that that's reflected in faculty as well, because there's this move now, especially because I'm in media and communications, they want to get practitioners in. And so obviously the people who are teaching have portfolio careers, in heavily inverted commas, in the same way that the students might find themselves entering into through sort of internships and that kind of, that forced flexibilization of working culture. So, you know, it's this expectation that the people who are teaching you will be in that position of kind of potentially scrabbling around doing 3 or 4 jobs and stitching them together as best they can.
And as weird role models for that, potentially as well, which is very different from the kind of role model of a professor in education who is there, you know, until they retire, until they wish to retire. Also that idea of tenure or those kind of previous models are gone, you know, that they just don't exist in the same way that they did a generation ago, I guess.
Yeah. So how do you find it when you're going to businesses to talk about this stuff? When they ask you about the 4th Industrial Revolution, what are you saying to them?
Well, there's a huge change in kind of what a professional might be, especially in technology, where a computer scientist or a programmer probably owes most of their employability to Google. There's an abundance of information and learning, and to be able to just learn just in time, just ahead of what you need to deliver, so just having those skills available to you changes the whole dynamic and whole way of employing someone. Suddenly it doesn't make sense to employ someone because they've had 10 years of experience and they've learned so much and they've immersed themselves in the industry. Where is it not better to employ someone who has a really good idea or is excited about what they're doing and has that ability to learn and evolve and adapt? And that's changing alongside with the ability to do stuff with technology. So much things like, so you'll hear the word AI, deep learning, machine learning being bandied about a lot. That's this year's kind of big data, and previously you've heard things like 3D printing and additive manufacturing. They're all terms that kind of signify big changes, but they signify something that was a few years ago quite complicated and quite heavy and expensive to do, changing into something that's quite trivial, quite easy. You know, it becomes easy to develop and make something. There's examples yesterday of, aside from the NHS hack, which we'll probably get onto at another point, of advertisements that now have cameras attached to them. So imagine you're walking past some posters or some interactives in town. Now it's easy for that camera to get an insight onto who you are. And for a developer, for someone that's just a case of spending 10 minutes connecting the camera to a back-end system. It becomes easily accessible, and that power and abundance, really. We kind of have this abundance of information, but also this abundance of technology that's becoming easier and easier to use and more accessible, cheaper. So there's kind of a power shift, but those services usually come from a power of a large company like IBM or Amazon or Apple or Microsoft, where they've kind of been enabled or let down, kind of disseminated down towards people as well. I don't know if pass on to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting sort of feedback loop between big data, so the collection of lots of data, and machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all this stuff, where as these companies collect more and more data, they use AI to analyze it all and make it sort of useful, but then it allows them to get more and more data. And there's a sort of virtuous cycle here where if you sort of get the first step out in terms of big data and artificial intelligence, you're going to end up becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is effectively what we're seeing with Amazon, with Google, with their Chinese equivalents as well, Tencent, Alibaba, all these sorts of things. These companies realize that these new technologies are essentially the key to controlling the sort of economy over the next 10 years. And I think if you sort of follow what these companies are doing, it's really incredible, and they realize exactly how significant all this stuff is for, not necessarily for the broader economy, but for having power within that economy. And this is effectively what I think we see happening right now.
I think there's a couple of tentpole projects that these big companies are working on, and I'll pick out 2 for now. One is the Google driverless car. So automated transport, make it easy enough and open up, allow everyone to get anywhere. without needing to learn to drive, without needing to own a car. That opens questions around ethics around AI, around around ownership. What's the point of owning a car when we all share them? But also ethics of technology. So the classic question, there's lots of philosophical and ethical questions about if that car goes into a tunnel and there's a child in the tunnel, does the car crash into the wall, or does it crash into the child? And those kind of questions and things emerging, it's kind of a tempo on that. And the other side is things like Amazon Go. Now, not everyone would have heard of this, but Amazon Go is Amazon's attempt at a retail store with no employees. So it's using computers and tracking in the store, so as you walk into something, pick up a bunch of bananas, pick up a loaf of bread and a few bottles of beer, and then you walk out the door, then it charges you your credit card automatically. The only staff there are the people stocking the tills. Everything becomes automated, and that's a very big insight into where we're going in one type of work. So suddenly you've got the service industry, the retail industry, questioning whether we need to employ people at all. And then you have the transportation industry, taxis, cars, vans driven. That's about 20% of the economy. It's a huge amount of work is moving stuff to people. And suddenly that will become just a bit of software, just a bit of technology that anyone has access to. But it reshapes and dramatically changes the economy as well. And same with kind of learning and education, is that knowledge, that abundance of stuff there becomes something we have free access to, but we still have to respond and engage with.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when I hear abundance, and I mean my brain always is trying to find positive things, so I apologize for not being cynical, possibly. But this notion of abundance, to take it on its face value, to do with education becomes amazing. Like the idea that you can follow self-directed training, self-directed education, I think is hugely emancipatory. Like I'm incredibly personally excited about it. And I meet lots of people who are like autodidacts, who want to teach themselves, who are actively questioning why they would buy into or pay for education. So like post-compulsory education. And I love this idea of developers owing their success to Google, but not because of its operation as a kind of multinational corporation, but its ease of search. So that thing of, like I used to work on an IT help desk, and one of the first things I would do every time would just be Google someone's problem. So like that role should and could be automated, and it would, do your head in a lot less for that kind of process to be automated, that type of work. But then, of course, I would be unemployed, or then, of course, the kind of knock-on is how much do we need to shift and think about employment as the way that we have access to these services. So the notion of wages being the way that we have access to the driverless car, for example, and those notions of value and worth around, my exchange of my labor for hourly pay or not in those kind of situations. So like if we achieve a kind of automated communist utopia future, amazing, but everyone will be able to learn excessively all day, every day. People will be, completely like off their heads on learning. I'd love it. It would be so beautiful. But there are kind of huge systemic things to work out to make that possible. If that's a direction to head in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that I'm very fond of that idea of having lots of time for that particular form of flourishing. But I also think if we're going to imagine a post-work future, we have to be really careful about whether or not the work ethic sneaks in a different form. If we're saying, let's imagine a beautiful future for ourselves where we can essentially work all the time in a different way, in a self-directed way, that's fine. But I also think having having the time, having free times that isn't attached to something that we already attach moral worth to is probably something to fight for as well. Like the classic right to be lazy kind of argument.
And to do nothing, you know, like doing, as an artist, the doing nothing part is incredibly important. That sense of like, things, you don't go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning and the ideas come out. You do some stuff, you engage with some other stuff, then something else happens in your brain, and then later when you're doing nothing, the thing happens. You know, the eureka moment, like that's a kind of cliche, but...
I mean, I'd also think about, like, when you're talking about what you did as a sort of a service worker, essentially, I wonder how much of that can be automated, given that maybe what people needed from you was the affective labor. They needed somebody on the end of the phone to sound patient and to make it seem like, you know, you can do this, you can reboot that, it's going to be fine, like, I'll talk you through this.
Yeah, like everything's going to be easy. The hand-holding is an incredibly, like, large part of that type of service.
Yeah. It's the call centre work in general, actually, and like Jamie Woodcock's book on this, it really focuses on this idea that what's being demanded isn't the retrieval of information, it is the placatory tone, and it's all of those kind of, and like you were saying, it's not the specific knowledge that even developers are being recruited for, it's this much broader set of skills. And that kind of ties these debates around automation and around work to forms of social reproduction as well. So actually, we know when we're talking about employability for people, we're not talking about specific skills that allow them to get jobs. Exactly. We're talking about we're embedding within people the kind of skills that make them employable. And this is this very problematic relationship around education, where to what extent are we imagining that what we're doing is equipping people with the skills that they want to go off and become revolutionary communists / Corbyn supporters, and to what extent are we actually producing a product for capital, which is not just a specific knowledge, but this whole package of soft skills as well, which people need to become employable in the face of increasingly automatable tasks.
Yeah, and in the face of being able to Google it, so of being able to quickly develop technical knowledge and adapt that technical knowledge, the skills that we're often coming to then, or you know, if anyone here is involved in like recruiting, you're barely looking at the CV anymore. And it is more around that thing of how does the person communicate? How are they going to operate under stressful situations? How well are they going to get on with other people who are already working? What do they bring in terms of leadership, in terms of galvanizing other people to action? And those are things that I have yet to see like a course offered, you know, in that university sense. But they're definitely they're definitely demanded skills that we as individuals demand from each other, and by extension, you know, are demanded from a kind of workforce, if such a thing similarly exists, you know, such an idea.
Of course, we are actually seeing this move towards these technologies actually trying to automate affect to some extent. Like whenever Facebook is like, "Hi Helen, we've missed you," I'm just like, I hate that. And you know, and to some extent, we are actually outsourcing some affective labor to our devices. You know, the fact that I let Facebook remember when everybody's birthday is, and then I get completely shown up when one of my friends is being a dick and puts a different birthday in, and you're like, "Happy birthday," and they're like, "No, it's the 1st of April. I do this every year." Like, you know, but I'm relying on these devices and these technologies to do that affective labor for me, the work of remembering, the work of kind of connection. You know, and there are now programs that will leave a message for you that says "Happy Birthday." So you know, actually, you can just let the Facebook profiles speak to each other. We can get on with the rest of our lives.
There's such a huge value in kind of the human aspect and that human communication as well, and that part is where a lot of focus on that automation aspect as well. So there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about this idea of chatbots and interactive AI. You've probably all seen ads for things like the Amazon Alexa, or you might talk to your smartphone using Siri or Google Assistant. These kind of human and voice-based interfaces for doing stuff. And means we can spend less time actually designing interfaces or things on screens, and we're more designing conversations because that's a natural way of communicating, interacting with each other, which we all understand because we're all human. We can all listen and interpret language and respond to those elements. But it's still very early. I have a lot of arguments with my Amazon Echo at home when I try and turn the lights off or get it to change to Radio 4 and it changes to Radio 5. For some reason, I don't know. But that kind of thing that's evolving, is being pushed more, but it's being pushed from a very much a consumerist aspect. It's being pushed by a company that wants to sell me stuff. It wants to make it easier for me to go, I need toilet roll. Alexa, order me toilet roll. And that's their economic incentive to make this available and make it cheap and make the technology there, because it opens them up a window to deliver more services. Likewise, going back to the Google car, if you're sat in your car on your commute to work, what are you going to be doing in that car? You're probably going to be on the internet interacting with people, which means you'll see more Google adverts, which earns money for Google. So there is this obvious kind of capitalist ideal behind these very idealistic long-term visions of the future. And we shall hopefully open it to more. Do we have any more comments here before we open up to the floor? Or?
Well, only that probably we'll know that Skynet is arriving because of these subtle acts of sabotage from our devices. Like, you listen to Radio 5 now, Alexa's decided.
I mean, I have nothing against Radio 5. It's just not as civilized as Radio 4 is in the morning. So, let's open it up to the floor. Do I have any questions, any hands? I've got one there.
Hi, Helen and Nick. It's Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
I have spoken to Helen on the phone before because I'm writing an article that's related to this stuff, and I wanted to bring up some of the issues. A couple of months ago, I was working on this project where I was actually employed as a writer, and I came up with utterances that were to go into an intelligence agent for a new one of these personal digital assistants. And it was very repetitive and boring, coming up with 55 different ways to say, switch my alarm off. And these utterances that we wrote were sent off to QA, quality assurance. And it was very interesting, and this is what got me thinking about it. Utterances came back rejected because I was bored. I was telling a story about a protest sort of indirectly through my utterances, somebody moving pictures around. And they got rid of half of my utterances because they said unnecessarily political language. They got rid of sexual references that other people came up with, even though people do move, sexual content around on their phones. They excluded obscenities. And it actually got me really worried because, as you were saying, all of these things from Siri and, Google, Alexa, and so on are being done by corporations. And with the Internet of Things, where they're controlling your radio, controlling your lights, it's actually getting to a point where a great deal of our social reproductive labor is becoming done through the use of these devices. And that's a real problem. By the way, social reproduction is the process of creating yourself and the other generations in your family as human beings on an ongoing basis. So ordering your dog's medicine and remembering your uncle's birthday is part of social reproduction. Having a fight with your partner is part of social reproduction. But what is really scary is these algorithms are not neutral. They're being designed by some flippin' corporations that are not particularly have our interests at heart, except for as consumers. At least that's my perspective as a socialist. And, I interviewed a woman for the story that I'm writing who's a black woman in America, and she speaks African-American vernacular English, which is its own dialect of English that's got its own lexicon and grammar and everything else. It's a totally legit, consistent language, but she's trying to get directions from place to place, and it's not understanding her usage, it's not understanding her accent, and she's having to adopt a really white-sounding voice in the car when her kid is in the car. Her little baby is hearing her having to sound white to access this robot that is supposed to be accessible to everybody. And so, I'm worried about this eliminating the world of work, but I'm also worried about it dominating us in horrible, horrible ways. You know, in terms of marginalizing groups, you know, a white-centered society is what's creating these technologies. The designers are white, largely. The engineers are white. They're mostly male tech bros in San Francisco. And I'm really, really concerned that this kind of stuff is going to get locked into place. Sorry for the rant.
I think it's a very good point to build on that. When you're developing something as an artificial intelligence or with machine learning, you often start with training data. So you start with a bunch of data about the thing you're trying to make a computer recognize. So let's say I want to make a system that allows my phone to detect this glass. I would give a machine learning system hundreds of thousands of images of things that are glasses and things that are not glasses, and then the algorithms can understand the patterns between those and build out the result for me as well. But the same applies if we're doing anything at a human level, if we're trying to recognize any kind of voice or faces. There's lots of examples of facial recognition systems that don't pick up people of color, that don't pick up non-white people in that kind of, because they haven't been designed for that person. They've been designed for a specific consumer, which is the generic white middle-class American in the case of, often in the case of Google. But these systems are becoming more embedded in everything, and to build on kind of the example of kind of neutralizing everything, there's a very big case recently of YouTube taking away advertising from YouTube took away advertising on videos from anyone who showed the pride flag in any of their videos. So they ran all the videos on YouTube through a detection algorithm to pick out things that might be LGBT content, sexual content, anything that might be objectionable to an advertiser, and then sold that information back to the advertisers to go, right, if you don't want to advertise on these videos, we'll just not put them in the pool for you. We won't make them available. And there's had a big knock-on effect for people providing sex education online through YouTube, because suddenly their advertising revenue has gone because they've suggested things and they've put stuff in there as well. So that kind of power you have with the data is kind of phenomenal. A lot of this stuff, Google provides something called TensorFlow, which is an artificial intelligence tool to build these things. And you can get a system that's been trained on 2 million images to then build on top of and train your own systems. And I'm not going to be able to do that myself. I have to use this service in order to make anything that's effective, in order to make anything that competes. Mm. But if that data set isn't great, if that data set has problems and biases, then my code, my system, is going to have problems and biases as well. So there's just this huge knock-on effects with these vast volumes of data that we're using.
Yeah, it's kind of this interesting sort of return of Queen's English in a way, right? Like, you know, within broadcasting, there's been this move away from it, you know, from the mid-20th century onwards to having a greater range of dialects. But now, because there's this engagement with the machine, a particular kind of voice is resurfacing, you know, and our world is full of these sort of digitized voices, like very often female, very often like fembotty, kind of slightly synthetic, telling us, please take your receipt, mind the gap. You know, all of these voices that kind of cluster around. But, you know, and YouTube is another example where actually people who've got a strong regional accent it doesn't get picked up in the captioning system. Yeah. So the captioning system will miss these voices, and the captioning system is also being used to drive advertising revenue, because the metadata from it is being used to kind of code these videos and say, like, you know, what products are being mentioned. So you might see, if you see one of those haul videos that like vloggers do, where they buy a bunch of stuff and then they go through it, if they've got a regional accent, very often they might stop and go, a dress from Zara, and then go back, because they have to do that. So the captioning will pick it up so that then it will get tagged in the metadata and so on. So it's very interesting, this sort of reassertion of a kind of sonic hegemony that's kind of going on.
Great.
There is a quite an amusing version of it, though. I recommend looking it up on YouTube, where there's a guy with a really thick Scottish accent trying to speak to one of these like chat things and just getting increasingly angry trying to order a sandwich. It's very good.
Cool. I think if we go to Simon, then we'll go over to you.
Thank you for being here. Queen's English, that's got me flash, and also the conversation was going on there about normative values in big data searches. And when I listen to the evolving thoughts about how we've got these few companies controlling access, shaping the affordances of the APIs that allow us to search the data and actually make our own businesses out of it, we're developing a sort of quasi-feudal relation with them, and that makes me think, well, when I came here, I thought this was going to be about post-work, and I know it is about post-work, and I was thinking, what are the imaginaries of post-work? Well, there's two that I can think of. One is pre-industrial Europe, and the other one is Star Trek. And what I like about Star Trek is that no one's doing timesheets, but everyone feels they're doing something worthwhile, even if they're a bit grumpy sometimes, apart from, the guy with the red top who gets blown away in every episode. But then you've got the medieval side of things, which is where we seem to be going, where we're effectively all becoming tithed slaves to Facebook or Amazon. And in that sense, there's no need to work anymore because they own us. And I'd just like to explore how do we avoid getting further down this route, really, without all using, say, DuckDuckGo.
Because obviously there's a third image in there as well, which is the Matrix, right? So, the vision of post-work future where we're essentially fuel for something greater than ourselves, which is somehow like the subterranean level of these conversations that we've been having. That actually, our value is our data. We're sort of plugged in, like being milked for a certain byproduct. But,
I think it's also kind of intriguing, like this. A group of young people who I've been working with most recently are involved in digital art and technology. So they are essentially like content providers. That's one of the things they're being trained to do, not the only thing they're being trained to do. And this kind of demonetization of YouTube for them is massively important, because it's shaping, so like this kind of notion of where the kind of power is or who's controlling what, it's actively shaping what they will make a video about. So it's not just a kind of censorship of existing things that might have already been produced, it's what happens as they go forward. So that notion of like pleasing the king or if it befits you, sire, that this is internalized, like this is within what their processes are for making something. And also they're incredibly critical of those, so these guidelines that YouTube have released for which content will be monetized, which will have advertising attached to it, are like loose one-line statements that have very broad things like anything with a political tone, or this wouldn't be monetized. This conversation, whereas we're not kind of this isn't a thing where we're inciting the overthrow of the world. Well, we might be, but
give it time.
Yeah,
give it time. The panel's not.
That might happen. But this conversation, for example, becomes demonetized. So the people who are involved in this, or the people who are recording this, or the people who are publishing this or putting this event on, if they're using that same strategic thinking like the people who I'm working with are, they're not going to even make this event happen. That's the kind of knock-on. So that's the real-world effect of this if it pleases you type of attitude that is, the position of, and that's the position of advertisers within that, and the non-neutrality of the platform, which I guess, Nick would talk about, in more depth.
And kind of going on, there was a mention in the last panel about kind of how do you market community events and put information out. And I think they were talking, the gentleman from Bread and Roses was talking about they advertise on Facebook, they push stuff out, they push content out there, but they're a business to Facebook's eyes. They're out to make money, so Facebook incentivize them to pay, well, I say incentivize, they make them pay in order to be seen, to trigger, they use the algorithm as a way of forcing people into that model of that in order to get noticed, in order to get seen. How many of you are here today because you saw an advert on Facebook about this event? There's a few hands going up. You're an effect of that algorithm.
You're a beautiful effect of the
You're a beautiful
algorithm.
effect. Yeah, we wouldn't have you. We wouldn't have you even. But you may not be here because you may not have seen it because someone hasn't paid the algorithm in order to push that content to you. And that shapes, and there's a lot of talk about this idea of filter bubbles, that we kind of sit in networks that only reflect our own political views, because they're generated by the algorithms that push us there. We only see content, we only end up seeing content that we're likely to interact, like, or get angry about. So that has an effect, and has a more effect that you only see content from a certain political view that you're likely to do those two things as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also sort of indicative of something broader, which is, again, the sort of concentration of ownership over data and over the hardware that makes all this data collection possible. Really, it's a handful of companies. It's Google, it's Facebook. It's not even Apple, actually. Apple's a pretty boring company. It's basically, produces luxury goods, and that's about it. Microsoft to some degree, but it's a handful of companies which are increasingly owning all of our data and all of the access to this data, and then increasingly producing what are essentially the basic means of existence within a digital society. So if you want to be able to interact with anybody, you have to do it through Facebook and Google and Microsoft and these handful of companies. So you can withdraw from that, but that means you effectively withdraw from contemporary society as well. So this is the real sort of power, and this goes to the sort of feudalism question, is like, if they own the means of subsistence in our society, how do we respond to that? And I think one sort of way to think about it is, back in the early 20th century, we had a handful of telephone companies that owned the telephone networks and dominated it, and they were turned into government-provided services, or there was antitrust regulation to sort of break them up. And I think this is the same thing that's happening today, is that these companies are monopolies. They are dominating these sectors in a way that is absolutely unprecedented. And there's a very strong argument to be made that either A, they should be broken up to some degree, or B, nationalized. We should be thinking about nationalizing these sorts of things, providing them as a public service, which means A, no more ads on the internet. It means no more clickbait. It means no more random things popping up when you click on the wrong thing. It sounds like a great internet to me.
Just to speak to this great question of Star Trek versus feudalism as well. Obviously, my instinct is to root for Star Trek in that situation because it's this kind of super diverse vision of the future. It's very super modern. Everything is sort of But there's also this tension because in terms of voices of dissent, there's much more kind of unified hegemony in the world of Star Trek than there is in feudalism, right? And there's also, because I mean, there's a lot of work around the Commons, for example, that's coming out of engaging with this sort of period of the Middle Ages and afterwards up towards the enclosures, where this was a period of very intense dissent amongst the peasantry. And it was a period where actually that dissent was made possible because people did have relatively unfettered access to the means of subsistence through the commons, through having a strip of land, through having access to woodland so you can get firewood, having access to pasture so you can graze your sheep. I don't think there's a lot in that I would particularly want to use as a basis for a post-work imaginary now. I don't want to go back to London and get up on Hampstead Heath with my flock and be like, this is my post-work utopia. It actually sounds like a lot of very hard labour and a very unreliable means of subsistence because you're entirely dependent upon natural forces to deliver you the right harvest and whatever. But because there was this relatively unfettered access to the means of subsistence, you had the scope for a growing kind of dynamic of resistance, of revolt, of pushing for new gains. Because we live in a time of great precarity, it's very difficult to sit here and argue for a push towards post-scarcity because we're all in this, we know how dependent we are. And you see this with a lot of the discourse around benefits dependency, for example. That form of dependence, it's bad to be dependent. It's a terrible thing. You're a useless member of society. You're not adding anything. You're taking something from all of us hard-working people. But actually, we are all dependent, we're completely dependent upon a wage, most of us, to survive, a wage or the state. So dependency is almost like a universal condition that we're all kind of attached to, along with a relationship to work. So I just think Star Trek as maybe an end point, but we've got to have a bit of kind of like feudal spunk to get there.
Oh,
We only ever see the people in the ships.
That's, yeah. Yeah, good point. There's a
I mean,
there's a
we
very
most
colonial
often-
dynamic to a lot of Star Trek, right? Especially the
We
early
most
series.
often only see the people on the bridge as well.
Yeah, who's working the canteen?
Yeah.
How happy are they with their paying conditions?
that's a good point.
They're 3D printing the food. Did you get that?
But who manages the 3D food printers?
Who's stocking those babies?
We could go on forever. Are there any more questions at the front here? So,
yeah, the issue I've got with AIs in general is basically modeling. Modeling is based on, rational behavior, but we know for a fact that humans are very irrational. And the perfect example could be, for instance, the models they used to use for banking. They use rational human behavior, but the root cause of one of the root causes of the crisis was irrational behavior of humanity. So, without actually trying to, disinform and control people, how would you actually make AI more useful to, human beings and let people be who they are without trying to change the way they think or influence them so you can manipulate them in a way that you see fit? So, for the best example is, for instance, somebody having to, adapt their, the way they think or the way they look so they could fit a certain, narrative. So every human being has got their own journey and, narrative and how they live, and, so why, for instance, what gives the society the right to actually try and remodel that? Is my question. And how could you do it in terms of, technology is a great thing, and AI is actually, yes, that's where the future is going, but how can you, incorporate irrational behavior, which is inherently what nature is all about? How can you incorporate that into AI systems?
So that's a really good question. One part of that will be designing the systems. So how do we incentivize people to design technological systems that account for the needs of as many people as possible? And we're getting there, we're slowly responding to. So accessibility is becoming such an important part of technology and the web. The iPhone and Apple are actually a really good example of that, as designing things for lots of different people to be able to use. But the other part is, with the irrational behaviors, is how do you account? I'm not sure how. I don't have an answer for that. Does anyone else? Can I open that up? How would you account?
The very notion of rational behavior is white-centering, is male-centering, is West-centering, is upper and middle-class centering. The best, one person's rational is another person's irrational. So I think the best way to deal with issues of modeling, both in terms of rationality versus irrationality axis that this gentleman was speaking about, and also about the issues of exclusion and marginalization that I'm speaking about, is democratization. So, for instance, I find out like last week that my sister just is working on a project with people who are trying to make sure that algorithms are reviewed by the communities that they affect. And that's particularly important in terms of stuff like facial recognition technology being used by police and counterterrorism forces. So if people are being targeted in this particular way, then the group that's being targeted should have democratic input and democratic review. Now, of course, the best way to do that is not some kind of PC-weasy, consensus-y, Wencesy way. You actually have to nationalize and control those companies. It takes state power. It takes democratic state power.
Great.
Yeah.
This is is about the idea of Facebook and Google being nationalized. Surely it's more dangerous to have a government in control of that much data than it would be to have a bunch of white middle-class hippies, ex-hippies, or whatever they are back there now. And is there not a way of bringing those kind of companies into like cooperative ownership in a way that would, so instead of the one top organizing the mass, that actually the mass, because we all contribute our data freely, are there not ways of the mass being able to get to that place of cooperative ownership in a way that would actually break that model?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's the one thing I'm really worried about too. Although it seems like the Tories can't update from Windows XP, so maybe we don't have to worry so much. But no, I think it's a really good point. So GCHQ would obviously love to have all of our data. The NSA would obviously love to have all of our data. And I think there's two sort of aspects here. One is the technical challenge of separating something like a nationalized Google from the security state, and then the political challenge as well. So could you make it so that there's political barriers in place to prevent that from happening? And I think why I'd be skeptical of sort of the co-op offering is because I think the corporate form is different from the state. You're a market, you're a consumer, you're market-centric within the corporate form, you're a citizen in the democratic state. And I think that gives you particular rights that you don't get in the co-op, and I think that those are really important, particularly when we're talking about data and things like this. So the ideal situation, and I'm not saying it's easy to get there, but the ideal would be a democratic state that gives people the power and control over their own data, so what is actually provided to the state and what isn't provided, and then having complete transparency over how that data is used. I know there's technical systems being worked on right now to be able to do this sort of thing. So I think we can imagine a sort of future where that was in place, basically.
Now, I'm quite interested in some more specific instances of where it could be useful to have kind of state-owned platforms. So I kind of think a bit about care in my work, and sort of health and social care, as well as sort of social reproduction in terms of like unwaged domestic labour and things like that. And obviously, with the kind of the changing dynamic of work, health and social care there are debates about whether that work is either going to be like super available for automation, because you're going to have this rise of telemedicine, and then you're going to have like remote medical procedures and things like that, or whether and also whether it's going to be really stubborn and it's going to stick around where other kind of sectors falter, because we've got these demographic changes that are coming, we've got an aging population, and we're going to have this persistence of sort of high-touch work as well as the high-tech work. So the lifting and the washing and the hairbrushing and the hands-on caring. Now, one of the real interesting things about the way the NHS works around health and social care at the moment is that often there's a huge number of agency staff that are coming in. And when you're dealing with agency staff rather than your own people, you have to pay really huge commission charges. So you're paying a lot of money, and it's not the workers that are seeing that money, it's an intermediary. Could we imagine a situation where maybe digital platforms are being used to directly connect people who need to be in receipt of care with people who are offering care, that it means something more than a sort of Uberization model of forced flexibility and instability and things like that? Could we have a platform where maybe, there is a certain amount of vetting that happens behind the scenes, so you do your DBS checks and, you look at the qualifications, but you find a way of connecting people so that if you have an urgent healthcare need, you can find somebody quite directly, and you're not paying those huge agency fees, so maybe you could invest that in training for those staff, so there's mobility between the high tech and the high touch ends of the sector. You're using it to pay them a living wage, so actually care is not a job you take because you have to, you can't find anything better, or because you have that sort of glowing need to take care of others, but it's actually a career choice that people decide and make. So I think there are different kinds of imagining a sort of nationalisation of platforms that can happen, but all of them require this kind of balancing of the idea of the collection of big data versus data protection. and to what extent would the nationalisation of platforms like that mean advances in data protection technologies that could then have applications outside of that setting in terms of, protecting us from things like state or corporate surveillance? That's a very speculative answer, but it's just something that I've been kind of dwelling on recently.
So that idea, if I understand it right, is a massive database of individual caregivers being able to connect to a equally massive database of individual people who need care directly on a one-to-one, rather than go through lots of intermediates, which is what happens now.
Yeah, I mean, how massive it would be something that would need to be worked out, like whether you have it for particular NHS trusts or whether you have it like bigger than that or whatever. But just this idea that instead of relying on agency workers because you need flexibilization, maybe you have this model where people can connect directly in the interest of actually making the standards of care better and also protecting the people who are doing that work. It's, again, very extremely speculative, but...
Cool. Just going to go over to here.
Oh, no.
I think it's called eBay for social care, except it's not eBay because it's not owned by anyone, except perhaps funded by the state to keep it going, to pay the techies to do it. And I think that goes for all sorts of things. So all this insecure work, businesses that have, in my interest, 3D printers, laser cutters, etc., could advertise time on it or its equivalent, and then anyone who wants anything made can just book time, so long as your qualifications are okay and you're not making nuclear weapons, which is probably what Google thinks I'm doing. Okay, cheers.
I think if we go up to you, and then we'll go over to the right.
Hi, thanks. It's just two comments, really, more than anything else. But it's one is we shouldn't discount the really, really big invisible companies that are on the sort of same level in terms of scale as Google and Amazon and Facebook. I'm thinking in particular like Salesforce, who are just as big, if not, in terms of scale, as big, but not necessarily on the visible end. So we should not, we should think about those. But also, it's just more because I can understand the sense of you want, you're interested in the political power that comes with a post-work future. And how that might come around. It's just more, we should also sort of shouldn't lose sight of the fact that although it's very easy to, we have the ability to look at the world today and the technology today and see what kind of jobs might be automated. We also shouldn't lose sight of the fact we also have an inability to see how jobs might change, which we should have a discussion about, because I think that in itself, we just can't comment on it because we can't envisage it. But I don't want to be in this sort of situation in 30 years' time where we're still having these conversations. Well, why didn't that happen 30 years ago? And that might be because we didn't envisage how certain openings or how even certain companies might not have envisaged how work might change. So that's just a comment from me anyway.
Yeah, I think I would sort of mention that it's not even jobs that we understand what's automatable and what's not, it's tasks, right? So, we can imagine certain tasks becoming automatable, but jobs migrating to different territories. We've been talking about the affective as being one element that things get pushed to, and it's really interesting the way that you're seeing this with the rise of kind of app work and sort of digital platforms, the way affective labour is circulating to new jobs. So, like, the taxi driver, for example, now when you go to Uber, because they need to retain a rating of, I think it's 4.8 stars before they get pulled off the platform or they get called in to justify why their rating is so low. There's this new shift towards schmoozing you when you get into the cab, and they're like, would you like a bottle of water, madam? Please charge your phone. What radio station do you want to listen to? So it's, instead of just being, I think this is something that's been running through these conversations, is not just talking about robots in the sense of the brawn, the machines that do things, the car that takes you somewhere, but actually the brains as well, the kind of the cognitive processing capacity, and also increasingly the kind of the affective realm that it's kind of segueing into. So there's this sort of holistic roboticization of tasks and jobs that we need to kind of navigate. And of course, it's so difficult. You're entirely right. It's so difficult to predict because change is happening so much faster. And we are in this world where developments are snowballing into things so quickly that it's very hard to sit and strategize. But the whole point of post-work, as far as I see it, is we're moving towards the automation of an increasing number of tasks. It's sort of on the left to try and get ahead of that. Instead of always being reactive, always in a state of emergency, always on the defense, how can we have a proactive politics that understands that things are changing, that automation is transforming what we do, in order to try and kind of mitigate some of the negative effects of that, but not just that, but to build something that we actually want. To have a left that's contentful instead of just saying what you're doing is bad, what we've got is terrible. Actually saying here's a vision of something that might be super cool that you could get with, snazzy Star Trek cybernetic communism.
I think there's also the part, when thinking about, like in that holistic sense, is the part of if we're thinking about what's happening right now, like what's already happening today, even before we think about the future stuff, is that notion of work and that nature of work has already shifted almost like unrecognizably within a generation. And the policies and the kind of governmental structure within which we live has not. So the idea of the flip side of work being not work, so these positions that you might be in and out of, and as a precarious worker, you might be in and out of those on a daily and weekly basis, are completely uncatered for in the kind of current setup. So the idea is that maybe each individual should have created their own safety net, that like we no longer have a kind of functioning safety net, like, the thing that used to be called the welfare state, but that's become a bad word for some reason. So that, I feel like, is actually a massive issue that probably needs to be addressed like yesterday in terms of its urgency, because there are, probably most of the people in this room have some experience of falling through that net, or someone very close to them falling through that net. And that for me, I think, is just too urgent to ignore, probably.
Yeah, I mean, this is one reason why our book has got the subtitle, The Politics of Free Time, is because it's not just that you have work and not work. You actually have a whole mesh of various forms of labour, some of which are recognised as work because they are socially recognised and usually remunerated, and others which are ignored as a kind of work, which is the sort of reproductive labour that takes place within households, which used to have some kind of provision through the welfare state, but increasingly doesn't.
Well, through the welfare state and through kind of societal, like as a feminist, I would take issue with lots of those things because the repositioning of women has changed the way that a lot of that functions. Like it was in the mini-feudal version, the man of the house who would be paying for that labour.
Yeah.
And so that sense of like that shift happened, that social and political shift happened, we still haven't caught up.
Yeah.
We're still like...
You have that move away from the family wage towards needing, because you have to work more hours to get enough money to live, you actually take away the possibility of even having a model of the family wage, which is extremely problematic to start with, to have this thing where everybody needs to work, but everybody also needs to care. So you have the hyper-exploited class of nannies and cleaners and elderly care assistants who are being super exploited because people can't afford to pay them huge wages, but they still need that care, so they end up getting the sort of the fag end of like what a household can earn, and they are themselves tied into these sometimes international chains of care. So we're pushing problems down into this sort of wider network. And it's really, the crisis of work is not just a crisis of wage labour. It's a crisis of work and care, which have to be seen as being joined together. You know, these things are crucially intertangled, and every change that we make in terms of our working life is a change that knocks on in terms of this unrecognised double shift or triple shift or quadruple shift that people are doing, caring for their families. And, you know, sometimes their friends who, you know, what happens if you don't have children to take care of you? You know, what are the knock-on effects of this? Who are our social safety networks now? You know, that's been completely dismantled, and there's nothing that's being done to really address that.
Definitely.
Fantastic. If we just go over to the right there, and then we'll come up that way, and then come down to the middle.
So my question relates to things that you've already talked about, which is how we transition from this idea of having one employer, one job for life, where you have a pension, you have holiday leave and sick pay, to this future where leisure time is valued and not everyone has to work. You've already touched on the transition we're seeing at the moment with companies like Uber and Deliveroo making the most of technology to allow you to work flexibly. But at the moment, the byproduct of that is that all of your safety net, your pension, your sick pay, those things simply aren't there. So I guess my question is, how do you answer that? Is it universal basic income? Is it unionization? Or do you have other ideas about how technology could help with that?
You can elect Jeremy Corbyn.
So how does electing Jeremy Corbyn actually help?
Well, he has provisions for people who are working for things like Uber. So one of the big issues right now is, well, they're counted as self-employed workers rather than typical workers, which means they're not subject to all the sort of regulations around sick time, holidays, overtime, all these sorts of things. So he has provisions to help deal with that. I think, though, so a more broader, sort of more radical proposal, because Corbyn's actually quite mild in many ways. I mean, I know the media says otherwise, but so universal basic income is one possible solution. But I think this is it's a long-term solution. I don't think we're going to get a basic income that is useful for most people within the next 10 years or so. I think we need to, so okay, imagine we get a universal basic income tomorrow, and it's probably pitched at a very low level. Suddenly, companies are going to be making the argument that we should cut the minimum wage so they can pay people less because you've got the basic income. As the years go on, it won't get bumped up because we don't have that social base behind it. So if we want a really good basic income, the first step is to build a social movement for it, to be able to actually pressure government continuously to maintain it. And that, I think, takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. The other one, though, which I think is much more plausibly imminent, is something like a reduced working week. And my preference is for a 3-day weekend. A, it sounds amazing. B, it also helps a lot with climate change. So one of the issues with climate change is, we have 5 days of people traveling to and from work, commuting, turning on factories, turning on offices, doing all this stuff. There's been studies that suggest that if the US working week was down to the average European working week, they would save 20% on the energy that they use. So it's a huge impact here if we were to cut a working day. And I think this gives us also more power as workers. So suddenly there's fewer workers available or less hours available, which means that workers can mobilize, push for higher wages, push for better working conditions. So it's really a win-win situation for workers and actually for the broader economy as well.
And it's also got the advantage of building on a very, strong tradition of arguing for shorter hours. There's actually, instead of it seeming like, like a kind of wackadoodle thing that we've just come up with, like crazy millennials, actually you're tying it into this really great history of kind of working class activism. So absolutely, it has to be a political struggle first and foremost, always, for pretty much everything. Every emancipatory change we want to have is grounded upon like a collective political struggle to some extent.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we had some questions over here, and then we'll go up to the top left.
Just thinking on a global scale, I found it really interesting listening to everything you've talked about, but I feel like it's it's literally for someone like me or for someone like people in this room. How do you think like this automation of our culture will impact on the third world or emerging economies that are maybe not at the sort of level that we're at now? Will they sort of continue to become this massive technological garbage pile, or would there be, is there already thinking in place that would spread out these ideas into their cultures so that they don't have to have suicide nets put up around their factories, and like there can be a general global progression, or is that kind of a secondary thing and not something that we're worried about?
No, actually, I think it's the opposite. I think if you look at these sort of effects of automation, they're going to hit low-income economies the worst. And the simple reason why is because we've been outsourcing all of our relatively easy-to-do jobs into low-wage positions there. So a lot of manufacturing could be fully automated today. And this is, essentially what China's built upon. So there's been a World Bank study which looked at, the effects of automation. It suggested that 65%, I think, maybe it was 77% of Chinese jobs could be automated. It was 85% in Ethiopia. It was a huge amount of jobs, and I think it's going to be an even worse impact on them. So the response has to be, again, thinking about how do we get beyond our dependency on work, our dependency on wage labor. And this is, interestingly, the studies on basic income, the experiments with it, have mostly been in developing countries. And actually, they've been really good successes, whether it be in India, Kenya, Brazil sort of has a quasi-basic income as well. And there's been a lot of success. And I think we can plausibly say that these countries can start implementing their own sort of responses to these problems as well.
Great. Going into the top left corner.
Hi, I was wondering how you overcome the sort of general cynicism you get when you put forward something like a 4-day working week, where people say, I agree with that, but it's very hard to get to because of whatever reason. What are the kind of first few sentences in that conversation? Do you go like, give people enough money to only work 4 days, or force factories to only be open 4 days? What are the concrete first steps? Because people only understand stuff that affects them in the short term. I can't convince someone that it's going to be better in 20 years. What do I say to do right now or push for right now that will convince people who aren't convinced and make them do something differently?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I always point to is that we love our long weekends already. The bank holidays are great. People really enjoy them. But I think you point to a sort of deeper issue, which is like the lack of any sense of agency, the lack of control over the way things are going. And I think this is a very widespread sentiment. And partly that's why Brexit was successful. The claim of taking back control was precisely that promise that, actually you can do something. I don't think there's any simple, there's not 3 magical sentences you could say to fix that. But I think people getting more politically involved, people starting to see measurable successes in their own lives is one way to start building a sense of agency. The other aspect is, the working class has been broken down. That sort of collective sense of agency that we once had, say, 40, 50 years ago, is now gone. We're all individualized. We all see ourselves alone in this world, maybe with a handful of friends and family, and that's it. But we don't have a collective sense of us, a class working together to build a better future. And I think it's something we should aim for. I don't have any easy answer for it, but it's something we should be trying to build up today.
I think I would also take slight issue with the idea of that there is a 5-day working week at the moment, because again, for so many people, precarious workers do not have a 5-day week. Again, this is like a vestige of a kind of old-style job that isn't necessarily in existence. And it's also about it's often talked about in terms of like a kind of salaried post. Whereas if people are exchanging their labor for an hourly rate, the first kind of movement to being able to only work the number of hours of 4 days is for that hourly rate to be 1/4 or 1/5 higher, in that kind of sense, which might be an easy sell in some ways. The sense of, okay, so wages need to raise by 1/4 or 1/5, in these kind of amounts. But then as soon as those kind of topics are brought, often it is closed right back down again. And so maybe it's around that sense of relocating the link between how long we are working, how much we are working, and how much we need. Maybe it's also about addressing needs. How much those that you...
Again, I think that's why free time is a useful concept to maybe frame instead of post-work, because what you're talking about is, actually changing the way, temporal sovereignty is organised, so having agency over what you do with your time and having more freedom in that sense. I mean, I think it's a really important question, because I remember, when Corbyn suggests, let's have 4 more bank holidays to bring us up in line with the European average, and then you get pieces in The Guardian, which is like, everybody hates bank holidays, Jeremy, shut up. So there's this knee-jerk reaction of it has to be wrong. And the same thing with the suggestion that maybe unpaid internships are a bad idea. Well, then internships are going to disappear. Well, if you're not paying people for their work, then why? You're only giving a very privileged minority access to the experience that they don't really need because they've already got a social leg up to start with. But you do see a huge amount of pushback to these things as well. So, all of the, I know you should never read the comments, but all of the comments under these articles are like, you're a crazy person. Why are you being so down on the possibility of having more time? There is this sort of instinctive, it's that thing about work for a lot of us, because the work ethic has soured, and it doesn't feel anymore that we get dignity from work to start with. It doesn't feel like this is a sense of, that work gives my life meaning, work makes me important. Because it is something that, even if we like our jobs, there are probably, there's a huge percentage of every job that is undesirable and feels pointless and that you hate. Actually, it becomes easy to mobilize around those affects, those feelings that people have about their work. As soon as you start getting into it with most people, there's maybe not my parents' generation, but my generation and younger, there's this real feeling that work isn't working, and we want to, so you can kind of engage with that when you're talking to people. But I think it's great that you're thinking about how you brand this. It's so important, to think pragmatically about it, because definitely I don't do it enough. I'll be in my Star Trek fantasy rather than actually thinking about how I'm going to convince, my granddad that this might be a good idea.
So we're coming to the end of the session now, into the last 10 minutes or so. Could I just get hands up of anyone who's got a burning question or anything they want to put up as well? Especially anyone, so we've got that, there, and then we may have a few minutes. So if we go up to that corner.
Where? Are you with me?
Yeah.
Hi. I'm not sure I've got all the correct vocabulary for this question, but it seems to me that underlying everything you're talking about is money. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts about if we're moving beyond work, do we also need to move beyond money? Do we need to move beyond the need for money? Do we need to provide for people in different ways so that the pressure to have enough work to pay for your life has gone? Can you suggest, or do you know of any theories which might address that problem?
I think this is partly what I find so interesting about a basic income. Because a basic income, provides you with that basic income. That means you don't have to go out and work. And for me, this is really, it's really liberating. The fact that you don't have to desperately go out and seek to find a job and take whatever job comes first. It's not necessarily a lot of money, but it's enough to survive on. And at that point, you can start freely making choices about what do you want to do with your life. You don't have to submit your life to 40, 50 hours a week of work. Instead, you could say, well, I'd like to work 20 hours a week and spend the rest with my family or helping out in the neighborhood. So basic income, I think, sort of responds to that. And you're absolutely right, it has to do with money. The only way to get beyond that really is like communism, which is sort of another step beyond. But this is, it's a crucial question. And I think it's the one thing that's really holding us back right now is, I come home from work and I'm exhausted and I just can't do anything else. I'd like to be more political. I'd like to be more active and do other things. But, I'm sure many of us have this where we're just so tired after work. And yeah, being able to step away and being not so reliant upon wage labor would be extremely liberating.
It might also be around like the kind of ideas of scarcity and abundance, like that we navigate as people, as kind of subjects in a neoliberal capitalist domain. So, like what you actually need and the money that you actually need to live is not the same as the perceived need. Like often for a lot of people, they're not the same thing as each other. But this, again, is something that's not very often questioned. It's something that through our kind of norms and through our daily life, we actively like reinforce it. Your shoes are nice. Actively reinforces the idea that I must own more than one pair of shoes, for example. And I can't wear more than one pair of shoes at any time, like physically can't do it at any time, So I don't need them, but something in our wider kind of cultural and social discourse is reinforcing on a daily basis that need is there. And for me, that's one of the things that I continuously struggle with, like personally, trying to work out what it is that I need. And that's led me into routes of thinking about how can I better repair things, how can I better make do, how can I live off less and less money, what ways are there that I can be more choosy about where my income comes from, about what I spend my time doing, my labor on, my effort on, and trying to make some of those judgments less about how much cash value there is and more about how much personal value there is. Like that is hard. That's why loads of stuff that I'm wearing is like broken or knackered or, it's just how it is.
I think this kind of brings us back to the branding question, though, to some extent, because I'm not sure how sellable a vision of a leftist future is if we're wearing Hessian sacks.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Like this is why like fully automated luxury communism is such a good idea, because it mobilizes this idea of post scarcity. In terms of like I would much rather be on a spaceship wearing Dior than ploughing a furrow in my grandma's.
There wasn't
shoes.
Dior. Yeah. That would be amazing.
Yeah, but this is it. It's this idea of understanding luxury as not based upon some people having something and other people having nothing. It's about this redistribution of that. But I think talking about lowering standards to some extent is a really great idea. It just depends on the context, because I get a lot of pleasure from clothes, and I don't want to imagine a future where I don't get to continue doing that. But there's this sense in which you can lower living standards, potentially lower the standards around things like cleanliness in the home, because that's a source of work. Trying to imagine these spaces in a different way potentially is an interesting idea. But yeah, and I mean, in terms of looking for theoretical models of what a world, how you can argue for something where money is disconnected from work, you might want to look, or from what we understand to be conventional wage labour, you might want to look at something like wages for housework as a sort of a model from the 1970s, where it was about people arguing that the socially reproductive labour that they did at home was value creating and needed to be recognised. And so that was a real sort of a real bold move by sort of those materialist feminists of that time. And a lot of the work that sort of welfare mothers in the United States did, was really based around asking for a wage to raise their children.
That kind of meant the opposite, though, like taking money
out of the equation.
Yeah, not we don't currently have it. Like, what happens if you just get rid of the money? It seems like some of these problems might not be there if the need for money wasn't there.
Yeah, I mean, so it is just communism. We knew we were going to get there eventually. It said there would be a revolution.
Or like the removal of all property. The notion of property needs to go. Like,
as we were saying earlier, that
debt.
kind of idea of renting things and not actually owning anything is a real possibility, is a real kind of direction we're going with business and technology at the moment. So.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of talk about this, sharing economy and sort of, we rent things, we don't own them anymore. But actually what it is the concentration of ownership with a few companies, and we just rent from them.
Yes,
so I'm really
still
skeptical of this sort of discourse.
Brilliant. So we've got last few minutes, so we're going to get the last questions. We're going to go there, and then that will end.
Yeah, but in a way, I think in most people's lives, it is down to a question of being able to survive one way or another, isn't it? And thinking back, I think if you think back to Marcuse in the 60s and 70s, going back that long, because, I mean, my generation do, the notion that chains of gold were enough to buy people off is becoming very fragile now, because I look at my own family, my own kids who've been to London and tried to live in that sort of very, very trendy culture where people are now really unable to do it unless they have very wealthy parents. All of that's dissolving. So the notion that you're going to become one of the elite is quite tricky. I remember when I was at Liverpool at the Take Back Control conference, I was meeting people there who were going back to Yorkshire, they were going back to other areas. They'd been academics in London. They couldn't, my own son left London because his income would only pay for a cheap little flat somewhere, and this whole thing is dissolving. So it's not just a question of choice or not a question. I mean, I think I was involved in the Housewives. I was a housewife working on looking at labour and stuff, and this is something about esteem. Now we're talking about people out of necessity wanting a decent life, which is about experience rather than just consumption. So that system it's not just about work, is it? It's about that system crumbling and neoliberalism not having a hold on it, I think. So, a question, yes. What question? What do you think? Oh, yes, last thing. I'm hoping that this might have a hope for places like Plymouth, which have been told they're feeling left behind, because talking to people who've moved down here, because it's a cheaper place to live in, you've got seaside, you've got incredible experiences, people are beginning to make those choices as opposed to thinking they've got to be in these city hubs where they're all getting poisoned by diesel fumes and paying the whole of their income to live in something in a commune, a collective, where they're reinforcing each other's own sense of, anomie is another issue.
You make a very good case for moving to Plymouth, I have to say. Yeah, somebody who lives in relative squalor in London, in the pokiest flat available. Like, yeah, I hear you and totally respect that argument.
No.
Cool. We got last question there, and then we'll wrap it up for today.
Thank you. Okay, so there was a mention earlier about our government's use of technology. I've just thought, before I get on to the point, to mention that the worm that attacked the NHS was actually based on code that was originally developed by the NSA. So just interesting point there. It wasn't the NSA themselves, but they had a leak and, what have you. Anyway, so on the issue of branding these ideas, of branding the 3-day weekend and the basic income or whatever, I'm a member of the Green Party. We've worked on this quite recently because one of the ways we did this was on the bank holiday weekend that we had a while back. That was when we decided to launch our 3-day weekend campaign to say, wouldn't it be lovely if we had this all the time, kind of thing. So kind of linking it back to what people are used to and what they expect and what they see tends to be a very good way of doing this. And of course, we've, as you probably know, we've worked on citizens' income or basic income for a very, very long time. It'd be lovely if Labour adopted it. So basically my takeaway from this is that I would love to see more cross-party working on things like this. None of us have a monopoly on wisdom. And I hope that more events like this will end up sort of building these communities where we can work together on issues that really matter. No real question to that, just a broad, I suppose, bring everything together.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that it would be very good to see more coalitional working around particular issues. It's completely changing the political landscape. I think it's a lot more diverse, a lot more plural, and finding ways of, it's something that's been happening like on the left at the grassroots level for a really long time, is finding ways of stitching together different kinds of struggles through these kind of strategic vectors of what do we have in common, how can we work together to get things done. So, yeah, completely.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That brings us close to the panel, and I think we're going to go for a Star Trek future of fully automated luxury communism.
Just what I hope.
Can we just
Hopefully.
hollow port somewhere?
Yeah. Hollow port
Can't remember what it's called. Teleport.
But you kind of seem like we started talking about technology, but it is actually very human, and it's very human issues and real things that just these systems and these technologies and these new changes highlight and bring us to as well. Thank you very much.
Hello? Fully, not so fully automated. Partially mechanized. Yeah, thank you everyone. Just a quick announcement. 25 minute break, running slightly late. There are 2 sessions coming up at 3. One is the progressive deal. What are we fighting for out of Brexit? We've got Nick Dearden, the Director of Global Justice Now. And then in workshop A, down the road, we've got Feel the Burn, learning how to canvass with the Bernie Sanders campaign, and Chaz Singh is also going to be sitting in on that one. At 6 p.m, there's going to be a pop-up disco in the main hall, and we'll start serving drinks. At 8 p.m, there is music from Diamond Family Archive, there's a pop-in, and Fantasy Orchestra. Tickets available on the door. I think it's pay as you feel, I think? Yeah. Well, whatever. Just, you're all welcome. You know, just stick around, whatever. And a meat raffle. A meat raffle. Would you like to make a quick announcement?
Yeah. So we do have a meat raffle, £1 a ticket. Currently, we have some tasty choice cuts of meat and sausages as main prizes, plus tomato plants, plus a print, and plus some merchandise from Diamond Family Archive, I think. Is that right? And from Zapoppin as well. So there's a table out there. Get a ticket, put £1 in a pot, and good luck.